on. I was originally going to give a paper about that's sort of like related to the paper Alex just gave in one way, which was like a history of concepts of reasonableness and rationality from like the early modern era to now, sort of focusing on the relationship of those concepts to, on the one hand, the faculty of reason, and on the other hand, reasons as considerations, and the different ways those different notions have related in different ways over history, which I think is sort of an interesting topic and maybe useful to contextualize the current debate in that broader perspective. It's also relevant to what Rawls is up to, too, in some interesting ways. You could see, actually, in the Rawls quote from Political Liberalism, he talks about reason as a noun, and anyway, it's arguable that that's a faculty sense of reason. It might be a mass sense as well. But anyway, that project quickly spiraled out of control, and I started reading all this weird legal scholarship about like religious belief and the reasonable man standard and things like that, and it just seemed like, okay, that was going to be way too much to tackle in this talk. So then I quickly, in like a week, wrote this, which is very much a first draft of another paper that covers way too much ground too quickly. But anyway, now by that time it was too late to write a third paper. So you're getting this paper. And it's a paper that in some ways picks up on some of the themes of Alex's talk. So it's a kind of attempt to talk about what you might view as some kind of like analytic critical theory. And I'm not any kind of expert in the Frankfurt School or critical theory, so I'm now very frightened to learn that. I mean, I suspected there might be experts in the room, but anyway, I hope they won't be too angry with me as I talk about these things. It's meant to be very respectful of that tradition, but it probably will not be in some way that I don't. Anyway, okay. So start off, okay, so what's the topic I want to talk about? Roughly speaking, how is rational critique possible? And what I mean by that is the question, how is it possible to criticize some social or political form of life on the grounds that it is irrational or at least less than fully rational? Now, for reasons that are very closely related to what Alex was just talking about, the proper answer to this question is going to, of course, depend a lot on how we understand the reference to rationality in it. So, for example, if being rational is simply being properly responsive to the real objective values and reasons, then there's no mystery about how rational critique is possible. For if this is what we mean by rationality, then any form of life that's not properly responsive to these objective values or reasons will count as irrational in virtue of that fact. So this is closely related to this sort of robust, objective, externalist kind of sense of reasonableness that Alex was talking about. So in this conception of rationality, rational critique is easy to come by because it can proceed from a standpoint that's wholly external to the practice being criticized. So I have no desire here to argue against the legitimacy of this kind of criticism. Sometimes the most important point to make against some social practice is simply that it flies in the face of what is objectively most important. And in those cases, external criticism of this sort may well be the most appropriate response to some problematic social practice. So I mean to be writing this paper, at least for the purposes of today, from a sort of pluralistic point of view with respect to critique or criticism. There may be many different kinds of critique or criticism that are legitimate. I'm going to just be exploring one particular form thereof, but without the aim of arguing against the legitimacy of other forms thereof in any kind of generality. Okay, but even though that's true, I think we should also acknowledge that criticism of this external sort carries with it some obvious limitations of both a practical and a philosophical kind. So practically speaking, its main limitation is, of course, that there's no reason to expect this sort of wholly external criticism to resonate with those it's addressed to. So if our aim is not merely to condemn the practice we're criticizing, but also to change the minds of its participants, wholly external criticism seems poorly suited to this task. In other words, if we want to do more than merely browbeat those we criticized into disgruntled compliance, our criticism needs to provide its targets with considerations that have some leverage within their current form of life. This brings us to the more philosophical concerns about external critique in this sense. And here I think the basic worry might be expressed in terms of the question of whether this practice of external critique itself stands up to further rational scrutiny. So for example, insofar as this mode of critique begins in some sense by siding with our own values or norms over the values and norms of those we're criticizing, it might itself seem to embody an attitude towards those who differ from us that's arbitrary, dogmatic, or paternalistic in some way. And this might seem to open the practice of external criticism up to a variety of forms of rational critique on, say, genealogical, epistemic, or ethical grounds. And a lot of contemporary metaethics and political theory can both be understood as articulating different worries of those kinds. Now, elsewhere I've argued that these kinds of reasons for dissatisfaction with this kind of robustly realist perspective on rationality and reasons aren't themselves as compelling as their proponents suggest. So I'm not someone who thinks these are decisive reasons to reject such a picture at all. I'm, broadly speaking, inclined to defend such pictures as viable ones, at least to some degree. But I also think that even the best responses to these kinds of sources of dissatisfaction aren't completely compelling in the sense that they don't remove, they leave a sort of residue of concern about the philosophical attractiveness of these kinds of criticism or this kind of model of rationality. So while I think it would be a mistake to dispense with the practice of external criticism in general, I think we should also acknowledge the fairly obvious philosophical and practical attractions of forms of rational critique that proceed from perspectives that are in some sense more internal or immanent to the form of life that's being critiqued. And it's those forms of critique that I want to talk about today, and sort of how such a form of critique might be developed. Now, unfortunately, it's with this kind of notion of internal rational critique that the real difficulties in this area begin. For it's not at all clear that we can locate standards of rational criticism, which are both, one, internal to the forms of life we mean to critique, and robust enough to give us a genuine basis for a non-trivial critique of them. For example, it's possible to critique a form of life insofar as it fails to comply with the standards of instrumental consistency. But these standards on their own hardly give us the resources we need for a robust critical project. After all, while it's plausible that most forms of life involve some degree of instrumental inconsistency, such inconsistencies are often quite minor or superficial. And moreover, instrumental inconsistencies can, by their very nature, be resolved in a wide variety of ways. And those ways are going to include sort of quote-unquote solutions to the problem of inconsistency that appear intuitively to be deeply unreasonable. So this kind of practical inconsistency on its own seems to leave us short of the kind of thing we're looking for when we want to develop a theory of sort of internal critique of the kind we're looking for. So the question here is how we're supposed to develop a conception of rationality that can ground a form of rational critique that's both internal and robust in these senses. And this problem is, of course, a familiar one. It's one that dominates much of the long history of Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy, including, most notably, the various forms of critical theory that are associated with the Frankfurt School. So in this literature, one can find a variety of responses to this challenge, and as a result, it might seem very foolish to try to offer another such answer here. But that's the kind of foolishness that keeps us in business. So I'm going to engage in an instance of that kind of foolishness to some degree here. But I do want to acknowledge that the sort of things I'll be saying here are such that there's lots of anticipations of them in that tradition of various forms and to varying degrees. So I don't make any claims about radical originality here. That's not at all the kind of project. This is a continuation of lots of things that have been thought by other people before. So the kind of view I want to argue for has it involves the following claims. So first I want to argue that we can view these forms of life, insofar as they're rational, as attempts to develop a certain kind of practical understanding. And then I want to argue that by viewing them in this way, we can gain an important sort of internal critical leverage on them. So in the background of this story is going to be my own conception of rationality and its relationship to understanding, roughly a view on which rationality is a capacity or faculty whose function it is to produce understanding. I don't know, if you want to look at a defense of that, you can look at some recent papers of mine. But I'm not going to sort of go into that background view here very much. But if you know that work, one way to view this is like an attempt to extend that kind of notion of rationality or see what kind of work it might do in this kind of more critical theory kind of world. See if it has any legs there. But I'm going to try to present these ideas in a way that's mostly independent of any kind of particular story about that. And I hope I can because of the sort of pluralism about critique I'm interested in here. I'm just interested in offering one potential tool to the person who's interested in this critical project. It may not be the only one. Maybe in the background I have more ambitious philosophical views, but I'm not going to get into them here. Okay, so in a moment I want to spell out the basic elements of, and I didn't start my, all right, this is, according to this, I've talked for 0.77 seconds, so I'm doing good. That obviously went well. So I'm going to spell out the basic elements of this account in a second. But before doing so, I want to give a quick overview of some of the most prominent responses to this challenge, just to contextualize my views a little bit. And here's where I'm most likely to run into all sorts of, I'm almost tempted now to just strike this section, because it's very big picture-y and it's just going to get me into all kinds of trouble. But anyway, so somewhat misleadingly, but still I think not completely unhelpfully, we can break these responses into two broad categories, depending on the kind of rationality they focus on. First, there's sort of practical responses that attempt to argue in one way or another that certain practical aims or norms are implicit in any social practice as such. So you might try to argue, for example, that every rational social practice must be at least consistent with respect for the autonomy of those who participate in it. So in that kind of way, you might try to add further practical aims. And I'm actually quite friendly to that view, as it secretly for the purposes of this talk. But we'll come back to the relationship between my view and that maybe later. But so you know, I don't actually think that's false, but that's one version of this kind of practical strategy. You might expand the conception of practical rationality by including some further kinds of appeals to notions like that. But you know, I do think those kinds of views have seemed unattractive to many people because they involve very robust claims about the kind of practical aims that are implicit in any social practice, and it seemed difficult to many people to make sense of that. I also think there's a real difficulty here with respect to what notion of autonomy is at issue. So autonomy is not an everyday notion. It's not a notion we have an intuitive grasp on. It's a technical term, and it wears its technicalness on its face. I mean, it's not something you would ever encounter and think is anything but a technical term. And yet it's interpreted in many different ways in the tradition. So one way, my actual view about the relationship between what I'm going to say here and autonomy is that this provides a way into thinking about the kind of autonomy that does matter, or one kind of autonomy that does matter. And so it's helpful to think about practical understanding because it gives you a sense of what particular sort of autonomy is important in this context. But anyway, so I'm not a foe of the autonomy-based picture so much as I'm someone who wants to give a sort of complementary view here. But nonetheless, lots of reasons for skepticism, and anyway, it's familiar, so it'd be boring for me to give a talk about it. So let's set the autonomy-based view aside. Anyway, a bunch of people in the Frankfurt School tradition, as I understand that history, would be suspicious about the autonomy-based view for somewhat different reasons. And I think they would have this sort of idea that at least a Kantian version of the autonomy-based view just doesn't have the universal status that the Kantian claims. Instead, they would say that the importance of autonomy, especially this is a first-generation kind of claim about the Frankfurt School, the importance of autonomy in the Kantian sense, at least in many ways, is the expression of a particular historically situated ideology, one that itself calls out for a certain kind of rational critique. So it would be a mistake to treat that as foundational for the whole critical project as such. Now, I think for that reason, there's this shift in the Frankfurt School that tend towards views that would be grouped under the second heading I'm interested in here, and these are views that are more focused not on practical rationality in some sense, but on theoretical or epistemic rationality. And that's, I think, what makes, in some sense, the product of ideology critique so central to the Frankfurt School tradition, especially in its first generation, and to a lesser degree, or in a different way, maybe in its second generation. So the guiding idea, of course, behind ideology critique is that irrational social practices are always maintained by complexes of irrational or false beliefs or attitudes in some way. And the necessity of ideology in this sense follows for the ideology critic from the idea that these social practices are always made, not given. So this is understood to imply that the existence of a social practice always in part depends upon the existence of some system of beliefs or attitudes. And from this, the ideology critic concludes that where such practices are not, in some sense, in the interests of those who make them, their existence can only be explained by the existence of some moment of false consciousness or confused ideology on the part of the people who are engaged in the making of them, in effect. So the details of this story are going to vary a great deal. There's all kinds of different versions of it. But I think it's fair to say that for most of the Frankfurt School in the first or second generation thereof, the centrality of ideology critique also meant that rational critique was focused on uncovering some sense in which ideologies in this sense could be said to be epistemically defective or quite simply false. You find lots of different accounts of falsity in some kind of broad sense. So in other words, for these philosophers, rational critique is primarily ideology critique, and ideology critique is primarily critique on grounds of some form of falsity or epistemic defect. I should note this isn't just a view of the Frankfurt School authors I'm talking about here. I think this was J.C. Stanley's view in his recent book. He has a kind of epistemic or cognitivist account of what ideology is and how to critique it. That's very much in sympathy with this kind of view. And people like Sally Haslinger critique that kind of perspective. So this is a lively debate, this sort of issue about how practical versus epistemic critique should be, the kind of rationality that's relevant to critique. Now, of course, this kind of epistemic perspective on things raises the challenge of trying to develop some kind of account of the sort of notions of truth or falsity that are relevant here. Sort of famously, I think many people think Adorno and Horkheimer failed to provide any kind of systematic account of that kind of notion in a fully satisfying way. Maybe they provided an account of why it's impossible to provide a systematic account of that, so okay, maybe that's some substitute. Probably the most notable sort of attempt to provide a sort of positive account of this sort is the Habermas kind of discourse ethics kind of tradition, where you find this kind of complicated account of communicative rationality and closely related attempts to define standards of truth or validity in communicative terms. And I actually think there are lots of really deep and genuine insights in that work. But I also think there's some reason for concern, both about the details of those accounts and about this sort of general worry that was very prominent, I think, in discussion of that work, which is that these kinds of accounts in general have made critique into something too epistemic and not sufficiently connected with real everyday practical concerns. Now, this is true, and this is why all this is a little misleading, even though everyone in the Frankfurt School stressed all the time that their understanding of critique was always both theoretical and practical. Here the word praxis appears a lot in ways I don't fully understand. But the thought here is still, despite that insistence, what really ends up happening here is an overemphasis on the epistemic or theoretical sides of critique and a de-emphasis of the practical sides thereof. So this is very prominent. You find people complaining about Adorno and Horkheimer turning away from politics in various ways. That is multiple dimensions, also has to do with their pessimism, of course, but it also has to do with their focus on these epistemic or cognitive issues. And many people complained, of course, that Habermas's focus on communication was somehow a betrayal of the project of radical critique. And again, I'm not endorsing that view, but I think it's tracking some kind of legitimate concern about some of what's going on there. So one of my aims here in this talk is to develop a form of sort of rational critique that begins from a perspective that does better justice to the idea of ideology in the sense that we want to critique as something genuinely practical, but while also preserving the important insights of this tradition of ideology critique. So I'm going to give a sort of more practical understanding of what ideology is and how it can go wrong in some sense. Okay, there's also some familiar worries here about whether sort of the claims that people make about Habermas, at least in some moods, makes about like the universality of certain aims or forms of communicative discourse are really universal in the way he claims them to be. So Geuss has this famous passage, again, which I don't necessarily endorse, but it's a good one-liner, so that accusing Habermas of the transcendental deduction of a non-fact and giving the transcendental arguments he does about communicative rationality. And I think in this context, a lot of people more recently in the sort of Frankfurt School tradition have moved away from this kind of transcendentalist project to a more sort of contextualist view of critique where they back off on these kinds of claims that there might be any kind of universal kinds of presuppositions of any social form of life as such, and just say something like the following. We really can't say a lot of substance about rational critique in full generality. What we really have to say is, in some sense, like you just have to jump into the form of life you're critiquing and see what you have to work with and go from there. And that, in various forms, I mean, that's Geuss's view, I think, in effect, and it's the view. Well, people like Yeagy are a little bit harder to classify here, I think, because they say things, they seem to explicitly commit themselves to something like that view, but it's not clear that that's actually what they're doing. But anyway, I think that thoroughly contextualist line it's not necessarily to endorse it, or at least I hope to suggest that here. That there are some important, if very abstract, things we can say about forms of life in general and how they succeed or fail that allow for a certain kind of rational critique of them on broadly transcendentalist lines, even if there's a heavy contextualist element to that story. Okay. So what's the thing I want to say here? How much time do I have left? I feel like this is taking too long.
Started a little late, right? But 20 minutes?
20 minutes more?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So all right, this is going to be a problem. Okay, so I want to focus on the notion of practical understanding as a way to think about the rationality of different forms of life. And so in doing so, I'm going to argue, roughly speaking, for the following 5 claims. So this is the sketch of the main line of argument in the paper. First, there's this idea that forms of life or social practices, insofar as they're rational, can be viewed as attempts at practical understanding. And in particular, that involves this idea that such forms of life involve an implicit or explicit attempt to form an at least partial understanding of what to do. That's what I'm going to mean by practical understanding here. Second, I want to say that as attempts at practical understanding, they are subject to the criterion for success that apply to attempts at understanding as such. Most importantly, that means they can be evaluated in terms of their ability to make sense of what is to be done. And I want to say that making sense of what is to be done in the sense that's relevant to understanding brings with it a number of non-trivial demands. First, as practical, it requires that the understanding in question be realized in effective action. That's the practicality side of this. And as understanding, again, it must contextualize the actions that one's doing in a way that makes it the case that they generally make sense to one. And I think that's actually quite demanding and brings with it a lot of dimensions of potential criticism in ways that aren't often recognized, or are recognized but not grouped together under the heading of this conception of understanding. And then I also want to say that this kind of critique can be viewed as sort of internal to the forms of life that are being criticized, at least in a non-trivial degree. And here I don't want to go as to the maximally internal view. There's like a wide spectrum of different views about how internal critique should be. I don't want to argue for the most ambitious forms thereof, but I want to say, well, this is a kind of critique that does, in an important way, make contact with what's going on inside a form of life. And so it's not purely external and has some important advantages of the kind we're interested in when we're talking about internal critique. Okay. All right, so in considering this, we kind of need to quickly talk about a bunch of different things. So first question, what is practical understanding in this sense? So practical understanding in the sense I'm interested in isn't understanding of practically relevant theoretical questions, although it'll often require that kind of theoretical understanding. Rather, it's understanding that attempts to answer distinctively practical questions. So where theoretical understanding is an understanding of what is, practical understanding is, roughly speaking, understanding of what to do. So that kind of distinctively practical understanding that I'm interested in here. Now, a really tricky question with respect to this conception of practical understanding is just which attitudes, states, or activities are necessary conditions on it or constituents of it. There you could think that intentions or various kinds are all that is required. You could think normative attitudes of certain kinds are required. You might think all kinds of skill and know-how and emotions and further kinds of things are required as well. I have a pretty inclusive view about what's actually required to get ideal or full understanding in this sense. I also, just to put my cards on the table, like a weak form of the guise of the good for intentions. So there's a sense in which all these views also come in a tighter package than they might appear for some other people, from my perspective. But here I want to remain neutral on that question as much as possible, so I'm just going to use the phrase practical attitudes to refer to the set of things that are required in order to have practical understanding in this sense. Just to remain as neutral as possible on this. And I'm going to try to describe those attitudes or the understanding question in broadly imperatival terms, so in terms of phrases like understanding what to do as opposed to describing it, say, in explicitly normative or evaluative terms, just to remain neutral in those kinds of questions. This isn't exactly practical knowledge in Anscombe's sense. We can talk more about that if anyone wants, but just important to flag that. Although I think Anscombe accepts the existence of both practical understanding in this sense and practical knowledge in the Anscombean sense, and I think she correctly thinks they're closely related, but that's a whole topic for a whole other time. Now, it's important to stress, I don't think this is an overly intellectualist picture of what practical reason or reasoning is like. And one way to see that is just to note that even like very ordinary cases of instrumental reasoning can be understood as sort of expanding practical understanding in this sense. So just ordinary instrumental reasoning, I think, is helpfully understood as sort of increasing our understanding of which determinate action to perform in our circumstances, or of how to do the thing that we've already decided to do in some ways. And those are just natural extensions of practical understanding in this sense. So even very mundane Humean reasoning can be understood as extending practical understanding in this way. And again, it's important here to note that unlike theoretical understanding, practical understanding requires, to be fully successful requires, its expression in effective action. There's a lot more to be said about that. But anyway, so hopefully that gives you a sort of bird's eye view of what I mean when I talk about practical understanding. I mean to leave it very abstract what it involves here, because saying a lot about it would commit me to lots of things I don't have time to defend. I have even less time to defend them than I thought I would. Okay, so why are forms of life viewable as attempts at practical understanding? Well, the basic picture here is, listen, to the kinds of forms of life we're interested in are forms of life where we have certain patterns of activities that are guided by the practical attitudes of the people involved in them. And where that sort of form of life is successful, it's going to actually represent a form of practical understanding, at least in a limited sphere or a limited scope. And I'll talk about exactly the degree to which that's true in section 11, if we get there, where I talk about the sense in which this is internal. But that's the intuitive idea. I hope it's not too crazy to think that forms of life, the kinds of things we want to critique, involve, when they're successful, at least a limited degree of practical understanding, at least within a certain sphere of actions. They make sense of their actions to the people participating in them when they're successful. Now, the next thing I talk about is sort of this connection between practical understanding and making sense of what to do. And here, this is sort of pointing to an important commonality between theoretical and practical understanding, namely that all forms of understanding contextualize their objects in a way that helps them make sense to the person who understands them. And this means that sort of understanding in general doesn't involve attitude by attitude correctness, involves something more systematic. In particular, to understand the answer to some particular question, you have to locate that answer within some network of inferences or relations of an explanatory or justificatory sort. And I talk about that in a lot more detail in other work. But I think that has important implications for just when a sort of attempt at practical understanding in this sense will be successful. Okay, so then I have a brief discussion of this question of whether a focus on practical understanding still remains too theoretical or too epistemic in this sense, and I try to argue that no, it doesn't. If we really take the idea that understanding is practical seriously, and that it's only successful when it leads to actual material actions or institutions or practices, we don't have that worry in the same way. This really is a genuinely practical form of critique. Some of that is just sort of pounding my fist on the table. I don't know if there's a real further argument there, but the idea there is just that sort of, if we're thinking about practical understanding, failures of practical understanding aren't just in the heads of the people involved. They can appear at any point in the relationship between mind and world, as it were, or any place in the world insofar as that world depends or should depend on our practical attitudes. So this isn't a merely internal critique of what people are thinking about, it's just a critique of what they're doing, just understood through the lens of practical understanding in this sense. Okay, so then I say, the really interesting question here to me is sort of, to what degree does this notion of practical understanding give us tools for engaging in an interesting critique of social forms of life? And then to what degree is that, the resulting critique internal to the forms of life we're critiquing? So those are the two big questions that remain on the table that we want to explore in developing this conception. How much time do I have now? Does anyone? 15. Okay, good. I think I can slow down a little bit. Okay. Was that intelligible? That little speed skating moment that we? Okay. So I want to look at a few different cases to try to make the case that we can get some interesting fodder for criticism out of this conception of practical understanding. The first I discussed briefly is this sort of notion of objectification mistakes. These are cases in which, roughly speaking, someone treats a feature of reality that's made or determined by one's choices or the choices of other people as if it was purely given or natural or necessary. Those kinds of mistakes obviously involve a failure of theoretical understanding in some sense, but then I sort of try to spell out why they also involve a failure of practical understanding. And that's roughly speaking just because even though these are cases in which there are features of reality that depend on one's practical attitudes, one can't be conscious or aware of that dependence without that awareness itself undermining the dependence in question. And that means we don't have to structure the relationship between one's awareness of this thing and the dependence of... we don't have the right relationship between one's awareness of this dependence relation and its existence to get genuine practical understanding. So that's just to show that we can think of this kind of classical case of objectification mistakes not just in terms of theoretical, but also in terms of practical understanding. Then I discussed two very general notions associated with practical understanding. These could be viewed as closely associated with various aspects of Kant's own views. And so I do think of this as sort of a proto-Kantian kind of, or post-Kantian kind of view of what's going on here. I think it resonates in many ways with Habermas's own views, although it justifies them not through a reference to communication itself, but instead through a reference to the idea of understanding as the goal of rationality, or in some sense. Okay, so as discussed above, to have practical understanding, you have to understand in particular why and how what is to be done is to be done. So practical understanding, again, is never piecemeal. It's always understanding of something as situated within a network of explanatory or justificatory connections or inferences. As a result, insofar as a form of life does not allow its participants to make sense of their actions by placing them within a larger justificatory or explanatory context, it must be judged to be less than fully successful as a form of practical understanding. And at the very least, I think this means that the ideal of full practical understanding provides us with a defeasible reason to prefer forms of life which offer their participants a more general or systematic understanding of why and how actions are to be done. In other words, all other things being equal, understanding, be it practical or theoretical, is better for understanding the larger or more systematic the context in which it places its objects. Now, this requirement is going to be defeasible, of course, because there are many other dimensions along which understanding can be better or worse, and some of those dimensions just sort of systematically cross-cut or push us in opposite directions. Understanding all the determinant features and the particularity of something always is going to push us in one direction, whereas understanding the sort of systematic kind of dimension of understanding is going to push us in the other, and that's a big part of this sort of struggle that's internal to the very notion of understanding itself. But nonetheless, we have this kind of diffusible source of pressure towards a more systematic perspective on things that's just built into the idea of understanding. So if that's right, if forms of life, even ceteris paribus, are more successful qua forms of practical understanding, insofar as they provide their participants with a wider perspective on what to do, I think that's quite significant. For example, it might help to legitimate the idea that ethical progress has a natural tendency towards a more universal perspective on ethical questions. questions about what to do or how to live. And I think it helps to explain why forms of life tend to be more rational insofar as they include modes of reasoning or reflection that are conducive to the placement of one's actions within a larger explanatory or justificatory context. So here the sort of idea is not to draw a direct line between sort of the actions that a particular form of life tells you to perform and this demand for systematicity, but instead sort of see this demand for a more systematic perspective as something that should be reflected in the sort of forms of reasoning or reflection that are involved in the form of life itself, and then seeing that maybe as having further consequences for the actions that form of life could license. Now, something similar I think is also true with respect to this issue about the connection between forms of life and the rational significance of other subjects or other persons. And there's sort of a few ways to get into this. So I guess here again in the background I have a view on which sort of understanding in general, even on the individual level, is connected to this demand for inner subjectivity. So even individual understanding, if I'm just worried about my understanding, it's still, my understanding would be better insofar as it's potentially shareable in certain ways. And, so that starts off with a sort of individualistic perspective. But in some ways I think we can sort of set that argument to the side here because we're already talking about something that's already implicitly shared, namely a form of life in some sense. And when we think about forms of life as attempts at practical understanding, it seems like the kind of practical understanding that matters from that perspective is always going to be the shared practical understanding that's common to all the different participants in that form of life. That seems like the natural way to interpret that demand. Now, as I said, I think you can give a stronger argument starting off with even a more individualistic starting point for that kind of conclusion, but let's just put that to the side here. So given that, it means that the sort of, when we're considering whether some form of life is successful as a form of practical understanding, we need to consider that question not just from some particular perspective, but from the perspective of every member of that form of life. And it turns out that the sort of common set of attitudes that are common to that form of life are incompatible with the practical understanding of any individual who's participating in it. That will be a problem for that form of life as an attempt at shared practical understanding in this sense. And I think that again has important implications for the kind of questions we're considering. For example, much as was true in the last section, I think it implies that forms of life will count as more rational insofar as they include modes of reasoning that are conducive to achieving shared understanding in this sense. And again, as I argue in more detail elsewhere, I think this means that the rationality of a form of life will be tied to the degree to which it's responsive to the perspective of all its participants and not merely to some privileged subset. So here again, there's a sort of implication for this idea of shared practical understanding with respect to the sort of forms of reasoning or the ways in which a form of life is responsive to different kinds of considerations or changes in evidence. Okay. So that's just to illustrate some ways in which we might sort of start to get this project off the ground. It's to be very abstract, and this is a sense in which I'm sympathetic to the contextualist view, which is I think that what you can say at this level of generality about the critique of forms of life is going to be extremely abstract, and sort of you're really going to have then to actually say anything more meaty or significant, you're really going to need to sort of fill in the details and see how these very abstract demands sort of play out in more particular context. So I'm sort of, there I'm being pretty concessive to the contextualist kind of view. But just saying, you can say a little bit more at this level of abstraction than they might think. I'm probably pretty close in what I would like to achieve, I think, to at least some versions of Habermas. So I'm doing it, yeah. I'm sure you think I'm just doing a worse version of Habermas. So that would be fine. Okay, so in what sense is this kind of practical understanding-based critique internal? Well, as we've seen already, I think that forms of life in the sense I'm interested in are going to be guided by some implicit conception of what to do. And I think, again, that in order to be really successful, that conception is going to have to involve more than a sort of piecemeal grasp of some finite list of actions that are to be done under certain circumstances. And that's for a bunch of different reasons. So first, in order to motivate the participants of the form of life in the way that we would like those people to be motivated, this kind of conception of what to do is going to have to embody some kind of sense of why these actions are to be done. Then again, since any such list is going to be very abstract or finite and so limited in one way or another, this conception of what to do is also going to have some kind of further sense of how to do these things in different situations that it draws upon. And finally, if it's going to have any flexibility or ability to adapt to new situations, it's going to have to place these things to do within some broader context that allows for the reinterpretation of these demands in different circumstances. Something that Yagi and her work on this that I've been very influenced by makes a lot of, and I think very usefully so. So in all these different ways, I think a sort of fully fledged form of life is going to be structured around not just a bare conception of what to do, but something much more like a form of practical understanding. perhaps limited in scope and in its depth and so forth, but nonetheless something that can be regarded as a legitimate form of practical understanding. And so in that sense, there's a sense in which every form of life is, I think, in the practical understanding business. And so it's not an entirely external standard to bring to bear on that form of life when we bring the standards of practical understanding to bear on it. In some sense, those standards are already operative in what it's up to in the first place. Now, I want to stress that the sort of way I'm understanding that kind of internal character of this kind of critique is tends to be quite modest. And in particular, I don't think it rules out the possibility of forms of life on which it's natural, say, for someone in that form of life to respond to this kind of critique by just shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, if that's true, then so much the worse for practical understanding and for forms of life insofar as they're intertwined with practical understanding in this sense. So I do think there's a sense in which these people could easily, certain forms of life could easily reply in a way characteristic of kind of Schmagency response to a certain kind of constitutivism. I don't think that that kind of response is impossible. I just think it's irrational in a certain kind of sense. Now, the sense instead about this that I want to stress is the following. Insofar as a form of life is rational, even in a pretty minimal sense, I think it can't be completely indifferent implicitly to the project of practical understanding. So a form of critique that's grounded in this notion of practical understanding should always be able to get some non-trivial foothold within any meaningful form of life. And so I think it's a form of critique that never operates wholly from the outside, even though it's maybe one that you could resist in various ways. But it's sort of making contact with some stuff that's going on in the form of life, insofar as that form of life is already in the business of developing something like a form of practical understanding. Another way to put this is that this is a form of critique that might be seen as operating with what seems like a natural generalization of a notion of rationality that's already going to be operative to some degree within any form of life that we might want to criticize. But any form of life is already going to have certain patterns of reasoning and reflection that are oriented towards expanding or being conducive to practical understanding. So this focus on practical understanding in a more global sense is just a sort of very natural generalization of those that should actually, and the generalizing move there should already be something that makes contact with the sort of implicit concern for practical understanding that we're talking about insofar as it's already present in this form of life. So it's like, this isn't going to be like completely compelling from an internal perspective. I don't think that's true. But it should resonate in some way with the way of thinking that's implicit in a form of life as such. So again, I think people involved in a particular form of life can always resist this kind of critical pressure. But I think that's not surprising. You can always resist the pressure to become more consistent or more rational, I think, no matter how you understand those notions. And I think the project, so given that, I think you shouldn't understand the project of internal critique in a way that sort of conflicts with this sort of truism. Whatever is good about internal critique, it can't be that it's completely compelling in that way from the inside. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at some kind of leverage, but it is a resistible kind of leverage. That's, to say something else would be to demand too much. In any case, I think even if we put that aside, I think as a purely contingent, and here just to move to a more contextualist perspective, as a purely contingent matter, I think most of the forms of life we might be interested in critiquing actually do have a pretty explicit commitment to providing their participants with a pretty rich practical understanding in something like this sense. So I think most sort of forms of life that we might want to critique do think that they provide the people who engage in the form of life in question with a pretty rich understanding of what they're doing that helps that way of life make sense to them. And I think most people, if they were told that, or if they were shown that the sort of form of life that they were engaged in didn't succeed in making these things make sense to them, would be troubled by that. So even if there isn't some kind of transcendentalist point here, I think as a merely contextualist point, this is promised to be a way of critiquing forms of life that can get traction across a quite wide variety of them. I'm almost done. Is that good? Perfect. Okay. Okay, so just to wrap up, if we put these points together, we've shown, or at least begun to show, or at least have begin to show, that a mode of critique which is based on the importance of practical understanding fulfills both of the two main desiderata noted above. First, insofar as is reasonable, it provides us with a form of critical leverage that's in some sense internal to the social practices being critiqued. And second, it does so in a manner that gives some real critical teeth to that critique, that isn't merely a critique of it on grounds of pure consistency. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that this model of critique is the end of the story. For one, there's a lot more to be said in developing it. I've just sketched the bare outlines of it. And as I said, this is really just a first draft of a paper that may not have a second draft, we'll see. For another, this model may, in the end, converge with other models once they're properly understood. So again, I've sort of indicated that I think actually this model is, and I've written about this in more detail in other papers, but that I think this model and the autonomy-based model actually do, or one version of the autonomy model and this model end up being the same in their implications. And I think that's actually a Kantian result. There's sort of an objective and subject-facing description of these demands, and you should expect that. So anyway, that's the sort of way I sort of talk about that elsewhere. In addition, I think there's nothing in these arguments to imply that other quite different models of critique might be more useful in many cases. So I mean to be a pluralist here about criticism or critique. Certainly don't want to rule out the usefulness of, say, more external modes of critique. Sometimes that's what we need to do, because I think no doubt about that. So anyway, thanks very much for listening.